Welcome to Southwest Desert, where adventure meets the arid beauty of the American Southwest. Join us as we explore the rugged landscapes, uncover hidden historical gems, and dive deep into the rich legends and culture of this iconic region. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon so you don't miss out on the latest desert adventures. Please leave a like or comment. This is very helpful. Let's journey together into the heart of the Southwest Desert. Imagine this. It's dawn in Los Angeles, 1823. The sound of thundering hooves fills the air as hundreds of wild horses are driven into massive circular corrals. But this isn't a roundup, it's a slaughter. Armed lancers wait at narrow gates, spears ready, as terrified animals are forced through one by one. By day's end, thousands of horses will lie dead, their hides stretched across the California landscape like a macabre carpet. This was the beginning of what would become one of the most dramatic criminal sagas in American frontier history, a tale that would transform California's Spanish Trail into America's first major organized crime highway. Welcome to the story of California's forgotten horse wars. To understand this chaos, we need to go back to Spanish colonization. When conquistadors brought horses to California, the animals found paradise. The climate was perfect, grasslands abundant, and they multiplied at an impossible rate. José del Carmen Lugo, a Los Angeles native, witnessed this explosion. When I was 8 or 10 years old, from 1821 to 1824, there were great numbers of wild and very troublesome horses, he recalled. They would come to the very outskirts of the town and eat the pasturage, leaving the gentled horses without food and even coaxing them away. Imagine thousands of wild horses descending on your town like locusts, consuming everything and stealing your domestic animals. The Mexican government made an extraordinary decision: systematically slaughter every wild horse in California. Lugo remembered 3 massive killing corrals built in Los Angeles alone. These circular structures, up to 200 yards across, were constructed with posts called estantes, driven deep into the ground. Cowboys would drive mixed herds into these enclosures. After ranchers identified animals to save, the killing began. Small gates allowed one horse at a time to exit, where lancers waited with spears. Many thousands of horses were slaughtered, Lugo grimly noted. The hides were the only valuable part, stretched and staked across the landscape. But while wild horses were worthless, the tame horses and carefully bred mules at missions and ranchos were precious. That's where our story takes a criminal turn. Horse trading began legitimately. New Mexican caravans would arrive loaded with goods to trade for horses and mules. But certain traders realized something. Why negotiate when you could steal? The first legitimate horse export was conducted by Jed Smith in 1827. Smith had just sold 1,568 pounds of beaver pelts for $2.50 per pound, nearly $4,000. With entrepreneurial spirit, he invested most proceeds in California horses. The math was irresistible. $10 California horses sold for $50 at Mountain Rendezvous, 400% profit. After negotiations and securing a conduct bond, Smith received official permission to leave with 150 horses, 100 mules, and supplies. But the frontier was unforgiving. Smith's plan to avoid the Nevada desert by traveling north ended catastrophically when Umpqua Indians attacked in Oregon, killing all but 3 men and stealing most livestock. The surviving horses sold for a fraction of intended value. This failure didn't discourage others. By 1830 to 1831, legitimate operations succeeded. But alongside legal traders came criminals. Enter Thomas "Peg-Leg" Smith, a different breed entirely. This notorious trapper earned the Spanish nickname El Cojo, the Lame One, and became synonymous with terror throughout California. When Peg-Leg arrived to sell furs around 1829, Mexican authorities ordered him out. His response was audacious. He departed with his companion but stole 300 to 400 horses, in spite of efforts of the Californians to prevent the act. Pegleg's clandestine operations made him nearly impossible to track. He would appear, strike, and vanish, leaving devastated ranchers and furious officials. By 1832, the situation spiraled out of control. Father Cabot of Mission San Miguel complained to Governor Figueroa that his mission had lost many horses and 108 mules since New Mexican traders arrived. Alcalde Carrillo of Los Angeles sent an alarming February 1833 report. Men from New Mexico, posing as traders, had stolen during the preceding 3 months at least 1,000 animals, mostly mules. His warning was prophetic. If the matter is not checked soon, everything in the country will be taken away by the robbers. In 3 months, over 1,000 animals, worth tens of thousands of dollars, had vanished. This wasn't random crime anymore. It was organized. Investigation revealed sophisticated operations. The Tulare Valley, north of Los Angeles, had become criminal headquarters, a gathering place where horse thieves and runaway Indians assembled stolen livestock before desert crossings. Don Damasco Rodriguez, sent to break up this operation, discovered 3 traders with 400 animals ready for transport. Though he arrested and convicted them, 2 escaped by scaling prison walls, taking their ankle irons with them. The criminals formed a multi-ethnic coalition, Americans posing as beaver trappers, fugitive mission Indians, frontier Indians, and renegade New Mexicans. They were teaming together to gather horses and mules for the drive to New Mexico over the old Spanish Trail. This was systematic, organized international crime. Pursuit operations read like action sequences. Antonio Avila followed thieves over Cajon Pass, catching them on the Mojave River. Of 200 animals they drove, most were stolen. He arrested leader Juan Jesus Villapando, but within 10 days, Villapando escaped and was never recaptured. Governor Figueroa's frustration peaked. He appealed to New Mexico's governor, stating that outrages committed by New Mexicans had become so general that every man coming from that territory is believed to be an adventurer and a thief. The response was unprecedented. Figueroa ordered military commandants at San Diego, Santa Barbara, and Monterey to muster forces and scour the countryside. All livestock in Tulares Valley or on the Mojave was considered stolen, regardless of documentation. Trade with Indians was forbidden, and all beaver hunters were expelled. Missions and ranchos supplied horses for military operations, turning the territory into an armed camp. The message was clear. California would use every resource to end the epidemic. The crackdown worked. Concerted military, civilian, and ecclesiastical efforts made horse stealing a bit unhealthy. The criminal network was broken. For 2 to 3 years, peace returned. The great horse theft crisis became history, but its impact was lasting. It demonstrated how legitimate commerce could evolve into organized crime when opportunities presented themselves and law enforcement was weak. California's horse wars reveal the complex intersection of economics, ethnicity, and frontier law enforcement. What began as Spanish colonial success, horses thriving in perfect climate, became an environmental crisis requiring mass slaughter, then evolved into international criminal conspiracy threatening territorial survival. The old Spanish Trail, intended as a commercial highway, briefly became America's first major criminal trafficking route. The men who traveled it were writing early chapters of the American West's most enduring legends. Today, Jed Smith and Pegleg Smith live on in California geography for very different reasons. One represents entrepreneurial spirit and tragic risks of legitimate frontier commerce. The other embodies the dark side, where fortunes were made through industrial-scale organized theft. The Great California Horse Wars remind us that even in America's most romanticized era, the frontier was where civilization and criminality existed in constant tension, where the line between trader and thief could be razor thin, and where thundering hooves could mean either prosperity or disaster. And that's how Spanish colonial success became American criminal empire, and how California fought back to reclaim its horses and its future. Imagine this. It's 1824, somewhere in the brutal wilderness of what would become Arizona. 14 American mountain men crouch behind rocks as Apache war cries echo through the canyon. Their horses are gone. Their fortune in beaver pelts, worth thousands of dollars, has vanished. Half their party lies dead, and the survivors face a terrifying choice. Attempt a desperate 200-mile walk through hostile desert, or die where they stand. One of those men would become the most controversial figure in Western history. His wild tales would captivate readers for generations, if only anyone could figure out which parts were true. This is the story of the Gila Trail, a forgotten pathway that changed America forever, where Apache warriors matched wits with mountain men, and where a teenage runaway named Kit Carson took his first steps toward legend. In 1822, two expeditions departed the American frontier that would crack open the western wilderness. William Becknell loaded a caravan toward Santa Fe, blazing what became the Santa Fe Trail. William Ashley sent 80 young men up the Missouri River to trap Rocky Mountain beaver, among them Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, and Tom Fitzpatrick. When both expeditions returned with staggering profits, news spread like wildfire. By 1823, hundreds of beaver trappers rushed toward the mountains. Among them were the men who would follow the Gila Trail: Ewing Young, Joe Walker, Old Bill Williams, and the Carson brothers. The Rio Grande and Gila River systems teemed with beaver, a trapper's paradise. But this was Mexican territory, and the newly independent Mexican government banned American trapping. The mountain men ignored these laws, establishing headquarters near Taos and stripping the Rio Grande bare by 1824. The Gila River presented a different challenge. The Mexican government lacked enforcement power in the wilderness, but they didn't need officers. They had the Apache nations. The Apaches were divided into fierce tribes, none more terrifying than the Member of southwestern New Mexico. They controlled the upper Gila and Rio Grande Valley from Council Rock, a massive copper outcropping where metal chunks weighed over a ton. These weren't random raiders. They were strategic warriors who had turned fighting into an art form, and they were about to meet James Ohio Paddy. In 1824, James Ohio Paddy arrived in Taos with his father Sylvester. Years later, James published a book about his adventures, either the greatest survival story ever told or outrageous fiction. According to Paddy, he'd rescued a beautiful Mexican woman from Comanches, earning permission to trap the Gila. He claimed to have bribed the governor with 5% of his profits. The rescue was probably fiction, but the bribe. Mexican governors loved under-the-table payments. In December 1824, Sylvester organized 14 mountain men and set out to test the Gila's riches. Following trails south to the Santa Rita copper mine, they hired Mexican guides to reach the Gila headwaters. The expedition followed the Gila westward to present-day Arizona, where the river plunged into a narrow canyon. For 2 weeks they struggled through what Paddy called a heartbreaking region of towering peaks. When they escaped to better trapping grounds along the San Pedro, their luck changed dramatically. Streams thick with beaver soon loaded their horses with valuable pelts. The men dreamed of Santa Fe fortunes. They should have watched the bushes. According to Mangus Coloradas, future Mimbres chief, Apache warriors had shadowed the trappers for days, fascinated by their beaver-catching skills. The Apaches were impressed, These whites trapped more efficiently than Indians. Better yet, they did all the tedious pelt preparation work. There was one problem. The trappers shot at any Indians they spotted. The Apaches found this annoying but not concerning. The whites were doing free labor, preparing pelts the Apaches could simply take when ready. That moment came as the expedition prepared to leave. The attack was swift and devastating. Half the trappers died instantly. Survivors were stripped of everything except their lives. The Apaches took horses, supplies, and all those carefully prepared beaver pelts. Patty later claimed they'd hidden furs in a secret cache, but Mangus Coloradas told a different story. His warriors simply waited for the work to finish, then took everything. The proof appeared when Mimber gathered at Council Rock. Warriors wore beaver pelts, and one giant wore a distinctive red undershirt belonging to Sylvester Patty. That shirt earned its new owner a terrifying nickname, Mangas Coloradas, Red Sleeves. Only 5 expedition members reached Santa Rita alive. While Patty's learned Apache warfare lessons, 17-year-old Kit Carson was transforming into a legend. He'd run away from Missouri in 1816, found Santa Fe trail work, and traveled to Taos hoping to join his mountain man brothers. When Kit arrived, his brothers had departed north. No expedition leader would take him. Too small, too young for dangerous mountain work. Fortunately, Kit knew Robert McKnight from Missouri. McKnight had taken over the Santa Rita copper mine and gave the boy work driving ore wagons to Chihuahua. At Santa Rita, Kit displayed remarkable abilities. He won friendship with the giant Apache warrior Mangus Coloradas, learned their language, and understood Gila country as well as the Apaches themselves. In spring 1829, experienced mountain man Ewing Young tried the Gila. His first expedition was disaster. He barely escaped alive. But Young never gave up. That fall, he assembled 40 of Taos's toughest mountain men, including Kit Carson as camp boy and interpreter. Young had heard about the boys' Apache relationships and language skills. The expedition started well, but reaching the treacherous canyon country, Apaches attacked. This time was different. Young's men were ready for war, fighting back with devastating effectiveness. In that first battle, Kit Carson proved himself far more than a camp boy. His rifle spoke with deadly accuracy. When smoke cleared, he'd earned his first kill and cut his first rifle notch. He'd graduated to mountain man. Young's band fought off several more attacks, trapping as far as present Phoenix before working back along the Salt River to the Verde. By the time they'd trapped the Verde to its source near Flagstaff, fur packs were as heavy as pack mules could carry. But Ewing Young was just getting started. Standing at Little Colorado headwaters with a beaver fortune, Young faced a crucial decision: follow the safe route back to Taos or chase rumors of incredible California wealth. Young chose adventure. He split his party. 22 men returned to Taos with collected furs, while he headed west with 18 best men, including Carson. Their pioneered route roughly followed modern Highway 66 between Flagstaff and Los Angeles, but in 1829, it was 300 miles of unmapped wilderness. Young prepared methodically, making deer hides into water bags and drying meat into jerky. Even with preparations, the crossing was brutal. Half their animals died, men became walking skeletons, but they reached Mission San Gabriel in early 1830. Young's California expedition was spectacular success. They trapped northward through San Joaquin Valley, reaching San Francisco Bay with bulging pelt packs. At Mission San Jose, Young diplomatically recovered stolen horses from mission fathers, earning supplies and goodwill. But the return journey nearly ended in disaster. At Los Angeles, Mexican officials demanded Young's passport, preparing arrest when they found none. What saved them was shocking violence. 2 of Young's men, James Higgins and James Lawrence, had been feuding. When the party got drunk in Los Angeles, Higgins simply dismounted and shot Lawrence dead in cold blood. The Mexican constabulary wanted nothing to do with men so tough they'd kill each other over grudges. They retreated hastily, and Young's party continued. By reaching Gila headwaters on return, Young's expedition had collected over 2,000 pounds of beaver pelts worth thousands of dollars. But they faced one challenge: getting illegal furs to market without Mexican arrest. Young's solution was masterful deception. Near Santa Rita, he sent all men except Carson back to Taos. Then they went to the copper mine, hid their massive fur cache in an abandoned shaft, and covered it with rubble. Continuing to Santa Fe empty-handed, Young obtained a license to trade with Apaches for a small bribe. He and Carson filled saddlebags with trinkets and returned to visit old friend Manga's Coloradas for weeks. When they finally reached Santa Fe with a wagon of beaver pelts, they were credited with history's most successful Apache trading venture. Mexican authorities never suspected those traded furs had been trapped illegally throughout the Southwest and California. Young had outwitted everyone, but more importantly proved the Gila Trail was a viable Pacific route. Following Young's success, the Gila Trail became as well known to mountain men as the Santa Fe Trail was to traders. By 1832, the watershed was overrun with American trappers, and the Great Mountain Man age was ending. Young, ever the businessman, had noticed incredible California livestock quality during his expedition. With Santa Fe Trail trade booming and enormous Missouri demand for horses and mules, he saw new fortunes waiting. Kit Carson joined Northern Rockies expeditions, organizing his own Carson Men Band. For the next decade, he'd roam the entire western wilderness, learning it as well as a farmer knows his fields. The Gila Trail had opened a pathway from the American Southwest to the Pacific coast, proving California wasn't impossibly distant but reachable for determined Americans. Within 2 decades, that pathway would carry immigrants to California in numbers, making Mexican independence irrelevant and American expansion inevitable. If you would like to contribute to my channel, join my Patreon community and discover my art print products on my website in the links provided in my description. Also, if you would like a particular image from my videos, give the timestamp for the image, and I will upload it to my website and Patreon. Thank you. Imagine this. It's a sweltering June day in 1843, somewhere on the edge of the Oklahoma Panhandle. 500 armed men are camped around a small oasis of cottonwood trees and cool springs. Their commander, the flamboyant Governor Armijo of New Mexico, sits atop his gray mule, his tall plumed hat casting a shadow over his flashy uniform. He's brought an army, Mexican regulars, citizen militia, and Pueblo Indian warriors, to protect a valuable merchant caravan traveling the Santa Fe Trail. But then, 2 dust-covered riders come thundering into camp with devastating news. Captain Ventura Lovato and his 100-man advance party have been ambushed. 18 men are dead. The survivors are scattered to the winds. And the enemy? They're coming this way with hundreds of Texas fighters, hungry for Mexican blood. What happens next would have been almost comical if it weren't so tragic. In minutes, Armijo's disciplined army dissolves into pure chaos. Without waiting for orders, entire units break ranks and flee toward Santa Fe, abandoning equipment, spurs, bridles, lariats, scattered across the campsite like remnants of a defeated army. The governor himself, for all his pomp and authority, can do nothing to stop the panic. This is the story of Cold Springs, one of the most forgotten yet fascinating locations on the old Santa Fe Trail. It's a place where military disasters, international intrigue, deadly epidemics, and long-simmering revenge all converged in the middle of nowhere. To understand what happened at Cold Springs, you have to picture the Santa Fe Trail in its heyday. For 60 years, from the 1820s to the 1880s, this 900-mile route connected Missouri to New Mexico, carrying millions of dollars worth of goods across some of the most unforgiving terrain in North America. Massive freight wagons, their white canvas tops visible for miles, would rumble across prairie, desert, and mountain passes. Cold Springs sat right in the heart of this commercial highway, perched on the edge of the Cimarron Valley, just northwest of what would become Boise City, Oklahoma. For exhausted travelers who had been pushing across endless miles of prairie, this little oasis was paradise. Fresh, cold water bubbled up from underground springs, cottonwood trees provided blessed shade, and the site offered everything a wagon train needed. But Cold Springs had been attracting visitors long before the first Missouri merchant ever laid eyes on it. Native American tribes had been stopping here for centuries, drawn by the water and the game trails that converged at this natural watering hole. And those same features that made it attractive to peaceful travelers also made it perfect for something far more sinister: ambushes. The rocky bluffs surrounding the springs provided ideal cover for war parties to lie in wait for unsuspecting merchant trains or mail coaches. During the Civil War, when military protection was stretched thin, the danger became so severe that the Army stationed regular patrols at Cold Springs just to keep the trail open. But it was in June of 1843 that Cold Springs witnessed its most spectacular military disaster. Governor Armijo was not a man who did anything by halves. When he decided to personally escort the spring merchant caravan from Missouri back to Santa Fe, he assembled an army worthy of a European power, 500 men strong, including regular Mexican troops, citizen militias, and Pueblo Indian allies. Armijo himself cut quite a figure, mounted on his trademark gray mule, wearing a dazzling uniform topped by a tall hat with a graceful plume. But Armijo wasn't just playing soldier. He had serious money invested in the Santa Fe trade, and intelligence suggested that the approaching caravan carried goods purchased by his own agents in Independence and St. Louis. More troubling, rumors were circulating that the Republic of Texas had commissioned a freebooter named Colonel Jacob Snively to lead adventurers north with orders to attack any New Mexicans they found on the Santa Fe Trail. So when Armijo marched out from Santa Fe with his small army, he was protecting both Mexican sovereignty and his personal fortune. The plan was simple: march to the Arkansas River, which marked the border between the United States and Mexico, meet the incoming wagons, and escort them safely through hostile territory. But plans rarely survive contact with reality. As the June heat intensified, Armijo made a fateful decision at Cold Springs. Instead of pushing his entire force across 140 miles of desert to the Arkansas River, he would rest his main army in the cottonwood shade while sending Captain Ventura Lovato ahead with just 100 men, many of them Pueblo Indians from Taos, to intercept the caravan. It was a decision that would haunt everyone involved. Lovato's force rode hard across the sun-baked plains, reaching a stretch of low sandhills near the Arkansas River after days of brutal travel. They were looking for friendly Missouri merchants, but instead rode straight into a carefully planned ambush. Colonel Snively's Texans, hidden in the sandhills, outnumbered the New Mexicans 2-1. The battle was short but vicious. Despite fighting with desperate courage, Lovato's men were overwhelmed. 18 were killed, many more wounded, and the survivors scattered across the desert. In the confusion, a handful of men managed to escape and began the long, terrifying ride back to Cold Springs with news of the disaster. When the survivors staggered into Armijo's camp, their report sent shockwaves through the ranks. In their terror and exhaustion, they described Snively's force as numbering in the hundreds, a vast army of Texan raiders bearing down on Cold Springs. What happened next was a complete breakdown of military discipline. Without waiting for orders from Armijo, entire sections of his army simply broke ranks and fled. The proud force that had marched out of Santa Fe with such ceremony dissolved into a panicking mob, abandoning equipment and supplies as they raced back toward New Mexico. Armijo, the man who had brought 500 warriors to protect a merchant caravan, found himself powerless to stop the rout. His authority evaporated as quickly as his army, leaving Cold Springs littered with the detritus of military humiliation. Days later, the very merchant caravan Armijo had set out to protect rolled into Cold Springs, having successfully avoided both Indians and Texans. The traders found the campsite scattered with abandoned military equipment and continued to Santa Fe without incident, their goods intact and their profits secure. But the Cold Springs disaster had consequences that rippled far beyond one governor's embarrassment. The Pueblo Indians had suffered the heaviest casualties in Lovato's doomed mission, and they didn't forget. From that day forward, they nursed a deep grudge against both Texans and Americans. 3.5 years later, that resentment exploded into violence. In January 1847, the people of Taos Pueblo rose in rebellion against the newly established American territorial government. Among their victims was Charles Bent, the first American governor of New Mexico and a prominent Santa Fe Trail trader who had built the famous Bent's Fort in Colorado. Contemporary reports explicitly linked the rebellion to the Cold Springs battle, describing it as an act of blind revenge for the losses suffered in that dusty encounter years earlier. The echoes of Armijo's military disaster had claimed more lives, this time including one of the most important figures in the American Southwest. But Cold Springs wasn't finished with tragedy. In the late 1860s, the site witnessed a different kind of disaster, one that spoke to the everyday dangers faced by ordinary travelers on the frontier. Jose Perea was a successful merchant from Bernalillo, New Mexico, returning from a profitable trading venture in Kansas City. His ox train was loaded with goods and making good time along the Cimarron River route when disaster struck without warning. Cholera, the scourge of the 19th century, broke out among his teamsters. One by one, the men began falling ill, then dying. They would literally drop in their tracks, struck down by the swift-moving disease. Soon, there were more sick men riding in the wagons than healthy ones driving the oxen. When the situation became desperate, the wagon boss made the decision to halt at Cold Springs. In an era before modern medicine, cholera was treated with whatever remedies were at hand. At Cold Springs, they broke open a case of penguin whiskey and mixed it with New Mexico red chile, the standard treatment of the time. For 12 agonizing days, they fought to save the dying men, but their folk remedies proved useless against the epidemic disease. When the surviving wagons finally pulled away from Cold Springs, they left behind fresh mounds of earth marking the graves of men who would never see their families again. Today, Cold Springs sits largely forgotten, visited by few and known by fewer. But if you know where to look, the evidence of its dramatic past is still there. Deep wagon ruts, carved by thousands of wheels over decades of use, still scar the prairie more than a century after the last freight wagon passed by. Some of the rock inscriptions left by travelers in the 1840s remain visible, names and dates carved into sandstone bluffs, though many more were lost when the stone was quarried for building materials. In 1960, the Oklahoma Historical Society made a complete record of the surviving inscriptions, preserving what remained of this informal registry of westward migration. Picture this. It's 1749, somewhere on the dusty road between Veracruz and Mexico City. A young Franciscan priest, barely arrived from Spain, is walking with his fellow missionaries when suddenly searing pain shoots through his left foot. A scorpion has struck, and as the venom courses through his leg, this priest has no idea that this moment of agony will ultimately reshape the entire Pacific coast of North America. This is the story of Father Serra, a man whose physical torment became the driving force behind one of history's most audacious colonial expeditions. It's a tale of Russian spies, maritime disasters, impossible mountain crossings, and the founding of California's first mission. But it all begins with that scorpion bite, and one man's refusal to let suffering define his limits. Father Serra was not supposed to be a conquistador. At barely 5 feet tall, he was a scholar who had volunteered for missionary work in the New World. But when that scorpion's venom spread through his leg, leaving him permanently lame and covered in festering sores that would torment him for life, something extraordinary happened. Instead of retreating into scholarly comfort, Serra transformed his personal agony into an unstoppable force of determination. He had studied Father Kino's revolutionary belief that indigenous peoples could only be converted through demonstrating that Christianity brought a more abundant life. But where Kino had been healthy and vigorous, Serra would accomplish his miracles while limping in constant pain, his infected leg a visible reminder of his commitment to suffer for his calling. The first test came in 1750, when Serra was appointed prefect of missions for the Sierra Gorda Mountains north of Mexico City. This was a suicide mission. The fierce Paine tribe had spent 150 years systematically destroying every Spanish attempt at control. They were master guerrilla fighters who would raid settlements with devastating efficiency, then vanish into mountain strongholds that Spanish cavalry could never reach. Previous military expeditions had failed spectacularly. Previous missionaries had been killed or driven out. Yet Serra, limping at the head of just 10 young priests, led his tiny task force into these mountains with nothing but a few cattle, some farming tools, and an unshakable conviction that he could succeed where armies had failed. What happened next defied every expectation. Within 10 years, Serra had established 5 thriving missions, each surrounded by productive gardens, orchards, and vast herds of livestock. Most remarkably, the Paine, these supposedly unconquerable warriors, had become one of the most civilized tribes in Mexico. In Spain, he was celebrated as the conqueror of the Sierra Gorda. But Serra's greatest challenge was yet to come. In 1767, King Charles III of Spain made a decision that would reshape the Pacific. Falling out with the powerful Jesuit order, he decreed their immediate expulsion from all Spanish territories. This created a massive administrative crisis, just as Spanish intelligence was reporting alarming news. Russian fur trappers, having discovered Alaska in 1741, were pushing steadily southward along the Pacific coast. The possibility of Russian invasion of Spanish California had become a nightmare scenario. José de Galvez, appointed as Visitor General to implement the Jesuit expulsion, faced a terrifying strategic reality. The existing missions in both Pimeria Alta and Lower California were collapsing. Indigenous rebellions were spreading, and somewhere to the north, Russian ships might be preparing to claim Spanish territory. Galvez assigned Father Serra to restore the failing missions of Lower California, recognizing him as one of the most forceful prefects among all the Franciscans. Serra gathered his 16 priests and led them on foot across 500 miles of mountains to coordinate with the Spanish Navy. When Serra reached the headquarters mission at Laredo in April 1768, he found devastation. Gardens lay untended, livestock roamed unmanaged, and most of the indigenous population had regressed to their pre-conversion state. Without hesitation, Serra left Father Palu in charge and set off immediately to inspect 14 other missions scattered across more than 500 miles of the Baja Peninsula. But then, in the middle of this enormous task, came the message that would change everything. Serra was nearly 400 miles from headquarters when a ship arrived with an urgent summons from General Galvez. Russian attack was rumored to be imminent. The king demanded immediate action to establish fortifications at Monterey and create a chain of missions along the Upper California coast. Serra sent word that he would visit the general when he completed his circuit. The response came back immediately. "The king has need of you. Come at once. We are going to found new missions. I beg of you, most reverend father, hurry." The promise of new missions was like an electric shock to Serra. Abandoning his circuit, he raced to La Paz. There, huddled with Galvez and Governor Portola, he helped plan what would become one of the most ambitious expeditions in colonial history. The challenge was staggering. Upper California had not been properly explored for 166 years. Most detailed information from earlier expeditions had been lost in the cluttered archives of New Spain. They had only Vizcaíno's journal and his notoriously exaggerated reports to guide them. Serra insisted that missions could not succeed without livestock, but Spanish experience had proven that cattle could not be transported long distances by sea without devastating losses. The solution was audacious. They would take livestock overland through territory that no white man had ever traversed, while simultaneously sending ships loaded with building materials and supplies to meet them at San Diego Bay. In January 1769, 3 ships departed for San Diego: the San Carlos with building materials and soldiers, the San Antonio with provisions and priests, and the San Jose with additional supplies. Meanwhile, Governor Portola organized the overland expedition while Serra completed his mission circuit. By May, Serra's leg had swollen to double its normal size and was covered with festering abscesses. Portola tried to convince him to travel in a litter, but the only concession Serra would make was to ride a mule instead of walking. On Trinity Sunday, May 21, 1769, Serra said Mass at Mission Velicata, appointed Father Palou to lead the Peninsula missions, and had himself lifted onto a mule. Then, with Governor Portola beside him, he led an extraordinary caravan into the unknown. 170 heavily loaded pack mules, 100 dairy cows, and a rabble of donkeys, sheep, and goats, all driven by muleteers, soldiers, and 30 indigenous archers. The route they pioneered that morning would become known as El Camino Real, the Royal Highway. It was unique among all the great trails of the American West because it followed neither a river nor an ancient indigenous path. Portola's only navigation tool was an astrolabe, and his only guides were Sergeant Ortega and a navigator who rode far ahead, seeking mountain passes and leaving messages on stones. For 40 days, they struggled northwest across 165 miles of mountains, losing 8 days to impassable terrain that forced them to backtrack. Sappers followed behind the scouts, hacking openings through thickets and prying boulders from the trail. Remarkably, despite the ruggedness of the journey and his constant pain, Serra actually gained strength as they traveled. When the expedition finally reached San Diego Bay on July 1, 1769, they could see the San Carlos and San Antonio riding at anchor. Initial relief quickly turned to horror as they realized these were essentially ghost ships. Scurvy had ravaged the maritime expeditions. Only 2 men from the San Carlos crew were still alive, and nearly everyone from the San Antonio was desperately ill in Dr. Pratt's makeshift beach hospital. Portola immediately moved the camp to higher ground and built crude shelters and a stockade. But deaths continued so rapidly that within a week, 2/3 of the men who had come by sea were dead. The only hope was to send the San Antonio back immediately with the few sailors still able to work, carrying news of the disaster to General Galvez. The San Jose had been wrecked on the lower California coast, but hoping it had reached Monterey, Portola organized an immediate overland expedition north. On July 14th, he departed with 2 priests, a navigator, 49 mounted soldiers, 15 indigenous archers, and 100 supply-laden mules, leaving only 8 soldiers to guard San Diego. On July 16, 1769, a great wooden cross was erected on a hill above the stockade. Father Serra, his leg still swollen and infected, said Mass under a canopy of branches. In that moment, Mission San Diego was officially founded, consisting of a small mud-walled chapel and several tents, but representing something far more significant. This was the first Spanish settlement in Upper California, established through a combination of political necessity, Russian threat, and the iron will of a crippled priest who had refused to let a scorpion's bite define his limitations. Serra had led an expedition of unprecedented complexity across unknown territory, survived maritime disasters that killed 2/3 of his colleagues, and planted the first seed of what would become a chain of 21 missions stretching from San Diego to San Francisco. The scorpion that bit Junipero Serra on a dusty road in 1749 could not have known that its venom would ultimately inject into California history a determination so powerful that it would reshape the entire Pacific coast. Serra's physical agony became the foundation of his spiritual strength, and his refusal to surrender to suffering created a legacy that extended far beyond his own remarkable life. Thank you for joining your desert frontiersman Alan for another Southwest story. Check out my large catalog of Southwest videos and playlists on historical tales, legends, lost gold stories, and adult bedtime stories. If you like a certain image from my videos, tell me in comments and give timestamp. Happy trails! Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.